Good afternoon, everyone. Son. Check. Good afternoon, everyone. Restarting. I am Matt Busick. You are at the Rotary Club of Des Moines, currently serving as president, and we're very happy to have all of you here today. We have one guest with us today, a guest of artfully, Bob Bauer. If you could stand and say hello to everyone. Bob is retired a couple of years ago, formerly Chief Global Economist at Principal Global Investors. Quick reminder, we've gone back to collecting cash for our foundation. You'll note the tumblers are on the tables. If you do not have a green dollar sign on your name tag, please be generous. A small cash contribution of $3 is what's recommended. Okay, one of the things that I like to do each week is tell you where I've been traveling. So where in the world is Matt? Last week I was with Eric Dickinson, and we were at the Chi-Chi statues, symbolizing body positivity. So there you go. I did not go in my swimming suit, you can see. If you're planning to travel somewhere fun, please make sure you stop by and see Kitty, check out a flat mat, and take us with you, or take me with you, so that we can make sure the rest of the club knows where you've been. It's a nice conversation starter. This Saturday from 9 to 10:30, there is a virtual opportunity to support one of our members, Claudia Schabel. She is serving as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Chair for Rotary District 6000 this year, and she will be hosting a webinar on that topic. You can sign up. There's a specific way to do it through the e-newsletter if you're interested in that. It'd be great to support her if we can. Okay, so now we'll move on to today's program. Becky Greenwald, President-elect, will step to the podium next to give you a quick reminder about our February fling. She'll be followed by Bob Bedrell, who will lead us in a moment of inspiration, the pledge, and the four-way test. And then Kevin Kassir will introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, Matt. I am encouraging everybody to join us next Friday night, 6:30 to 9:30 at the Botanical Garden. We're going to have a great time. A time for you to come, bring yourselves, date night, bring friends, however you want to do it. We're going to have business casual attire. We're going to have little activities going on, a little scavenger hunt, good times talking with Rotarians, and we're going to have a photographer there. So we really encourage people to come. We're going to take as many photos of folks as we can, and we'll have brief remarks at 7:30. The whole thing runs from 6:30 till 9:30. Come and go. We'll have some brief remarks and maybe try to do a group photos just after that around 7:30, so that might help you with your planning. Love to see you. Still can sign up through tomorrow, and then we'll be getting those reservations into the Botanical Garden. So look forward to having you there. The more the better. Thanks so much. I want to also acknowledge we have a anonymous sponsor, and Craig Ibsen with Next Level Ventures is also sponsoring the event for us. So I want to be sure to give them the kudos for helping us out. Bye-bye.
Well, good afternoon, fellow Rotarians.
Hi, Bob. Hi, Bob.
It's a wonderful day in the
Neighborhood.
Absolutely. And that wise sage, Mr. Rogers, read a few quotes. As human beings, our job in life is to help people realize how rare and valuable each one of us really is. That each one of us has something that no one else has, or ever will have something inside that is unique to all time. It is our job to encourage each other to discover that uniqueness and providing ways of developing its expression. We all get so wrapped up in the numbers in our society. The most important thing is that we are able to be one-to-one, you and I, with each other at the moment. If we can be present to the moment with the person that we happen to be with, That's what's important. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. If only you could sense how important you are to the lives of those you meet, how important you can be to the people you may never dream of. There is something of yourself you can leave at every meeting with another person. And lastly, it's not so much what we have in life that matters, it's what we do with what we have. You join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? Now please greet your fellow Rotarians.
I went to halftime this year, and it would be exactly the same schedule that I had last year. So I realized I just negotiated to half pay. That was kind of irritating. So I'm going to retire in June effectively, so I don't have enough time to work on it. So I thought I was going to be able to work on it when I went to halftime. So I'll still have plenty of things to do.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Hi, Kevin.
You know, once again, we have another great keynote speaker on a topic that is timely. So just want to recognize the great work that our program committee does time and time again, week after week. Pulls in the ideas, ranks those ideas, the best ideas come to the top, schedules the great speakers that we have. Just tremendous amount of work. I don't see Mark Lyons here, our chair, but I do see Susan Junkett. So for everybody on the program committee, can you guys just give them a little bit of a hand? Now to our keynote speaker. I'm very excited to introduce economist Dr. Peter Orszin. You will see he brings a unique perspective with a local Midwestern focus, but yet a lot of experience globally. And I can assure you this global world is a very small place, so we're all tied together, certainly from an economic perspective. Peter's been on the faculty of Iowa State University since 1982 and currently serves as the University Professor of Economics and Director of the Program of the Study of Midwest Markets and Entrepreneurship. He is a 1977 graduate in economics at the University of Kansas and then received his PhD in economics from Yale University in 1983. In 2018, he served as a Fulbright Fellow, I'm going to say at a university in Slovenia, because I'm not going to take a shot at trying to pronounce that university in Slovenia. His research deals with labor markets in the United States and in developing countries, in particular interest in human capital, regional economic development, and again, in entrepreneurship. He is a co-author of chapters in the Handbook of Development Economics and the Handbook of Agricultural Economics. He served as a member of the core team for the World Bank's 2007 World Development Report and wrote papers for 2008, 2012, and 2015 editions of the Copenhagen Consensus. His research has appeared in the American Economic Review, the Journal of Political Economy, the Review of Economics and Statistics, and the Journal of Finance and International Economic Review, and numerous other outlets. So with that, Please help me give a warm Rotary welcome to Dr. Peter Orzum of Iowa State University.
Well, thank you. That was a very nice introduction. I want to acknowledge Bob Bauer, who's here. Bob, I was on his dissertation committee. Bob had been farming, I think, in Winterset. He'd always wanted to go to grad school, but his dad got sick about the time he graduated in mathematics from Iowa State. And then after 20 years, I think he had 2 people who were sort of running the farm, and he thought he could drive 80 miles each way. He said it was an hour each way, which you must have really been tooling along. But he was just a fabulous student, and the Journal of Finance paper is with Bob, so that was my one and only Journal of Finance foray. And thanks to Susan Judkins for asking me to come, and to Kitty Morehouse also for making this possible. I think they were looking for the only economist at Iowa State old enough to remember inflation. And when I came in 1982, my wife wanted to buy a house. Our mortgage was 12.5%. Adjustable rate mortgage. The inflation rate was was actually higher than that at the time. We had a 10% unemployment rate in the country, and the concern at the time that the Fed was dealing with was stagflation. And stagflation is high unemployment and high inflation rates at the same time. And we have, and this is what I believe the Federal Reserve is really worried about now, is a different form of stagflation. They don't say this publicly, but it's clear that they're very focused on labor markets, and I'm a labor economist. The reason they're looking at that is the new form of stagflation is high inflation, low unemployment rates, but also at the same time low employment rates. And that those low employment rates are being driven by the weak labor supply response to the economic expansion that's followed the pandemic. And I'll try to make that clear as we go along. So just to preface what we're going to be concluding, if you look at different economic indicators, some of them are as good as we've ever had, and some of them are somewhat more troublesome. And so we'll start with the good news, and then I'll finish up depressing the hell out of you for the rest of the 18 slides. So if you look at GDP response and the unemployment rate, this was a very rapid response. I'll show you what the numbers look like, but we very rapidly recovered to our pre-pandemic levels, and within 2 years. And if you look at that, this is the fastest recovery we've ever had from a recession. On the other hand, at the same time, and by the way, these slides will be made available to you if you're interested, so you don't have to sort of try to take a lot of notes or something like that. Employment rates and labor force participation rates went down, and they've stayed persistently down, and I'm going to argue are not likely to be recovering anytime soon for various reasons. If you look at vacancy rates, every month we have very robust new vacancies being created, and we have trouble filling them. And that's true across the board in terms of all sectors of the economy in all parts of the United States. If you look at inflationary pressures, I'm going to argue that the government response to the pandemic was way out of line with the actual economic disruption, and that's creating what you might call a pandemic overhang. There's also a pandemic overhang in terms of the shutdowns that occurred, and then some of the states having trouble regaining some of the sectors that they shut down during the pandemic. And then finally, and I don't want to belittle this point, we had very stable values of the dollar over an extended period of time. So virtually all the people in the Federal Reserve who are now tasked with trying to get rid of inflation have never experienced inflation in their careers. And that's true also of the people in banks and in business who are trying to figure out how to incorporate uncertain future values of the dollar in terms of their investment decisions and so on. And that uncertainty, I think, is creating a lot of unease in the population. I'll show you what that looks like. So first, the good news. The Federal Reserve will come up with what sounds like an oxymoron, the full employment level of unemployment, right? So what do we mean by that? With a dynamic economy like ours, you'll never get to zero unemployment. You can view the labor market as a giant game of musical chairs, and there are always some chairs being taken away from one part of the economy or one part of the United States, and there are chairs that are showing up in other parts, and so there's going to be some amount of friction related to how quickly you're going to find people who've lost their chairs to find new chairs. And there are always people who are entering the game for the first time, and so they're going to have some amount of time looking for that first position. And so when we think of an equilibrium level of unemployment, if we have as many vacancies as there are people who are unemployed, you'd say, okay, that's a well-functioning labor market. We currently have 1.8 vacancies for every one person who's employed in the US, and that's been true for almost 2 years now. And so we have a massive number of jobs that go begging every month. If you compare what happened in this pandemic recession to other recessions, you can see what the Great Recession looked like. This is when I got employed at Iowa State. It took 7 years for the unemployment rate to go back to its pre-recession levels. And this is the pandemic recession. We were back to pre-pandemic levels of unemployment in 30 months, in 2.5 years. This is by far the fastest recovery of any recession we've had in the history of the US. If you look at things like GDP growth, it took just a little bit of time for us to get back to our pre-pandemic trend. It took 2 years for us to get back to pre-pandemic trend GDP, whereas if you look at, say, the Great Recession, it took a considerable amount of time for us to get back on pre-recession trends. So why is that? It's because this wasn't a normal recession. Most recessions, you have some fundamental weakness in the economy, and it's going to take a while for the markets to adjust to repair that damage. The Great Recession was primarily weakness in the financial system of the US. This was a shutdown of an otherwise functioning economy. The unemployment rate in February of 2020 was 3.5%. That's as low as it gets. Well, until this January when it got to 3.4%. But it was a very well-functioning economy, and we just shut it down, and then we can reopen it. And for the most part, we were able to recover to what we were doing before. So if, in fact, we have a relatively quick recovery from the pandemic, GDP seems to have rebounded very rapidly. Why aren't we happy? And the answer is the other part of the story, right? Why is it that the economy, why are people so nervous about the economy? Why is inflation so apparently persistent? And the answer is weakness in the labor market. So just to give you an example, in the Great Recession, what normally happens in a recession is the rate of hiring goes down, layoffs go up, job vacancy openings go down, and the quit rate goes down, because you don't want to quit in a market where you're not sure you're going to be able to find another job. So what happens during this pandemic recession? The job opening rate is at its highest level ever, and it's stayed up I'll give you the actual numbers in just a second. The hiring rate goes up, and it is not yet back to what the pre-pandemic hiring rates were. Quit rates have gone up and have stayed high month to month, and layoff rates are low. So, you know, on NPR, they're constantly talking about the 7,000 jobs that disappear from Google or something along those lines. Well, it's still a very robust labor market. So what you have here on the right-hand side are the pre-pandemic averages for the turnover rates, job turnover rates in the U.S. And these are the most recent numbers from the December report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Here's how many job openings we have per month. It's almost twice what the pre-pandemic average was. So we don't have a weakness in labor demand. What we have is a weakness in labor supply. So 44% of those vacancies are unfilled by the end of the month. Pre-pandemic, we would only have 5% of those jobs going begging by the end of the month. And so what you see is, even though hiring is extremely robust, we had a fabulous number in January, a lot of the hiring is people who are quitting one job and moving to another job. And we actually are running into a situation where quits are why people leave one job and they're moving to other jobs. It's not that layoffs are a particularly important aspect of the current economy. If you look at Iowa numbers, they're exactly the same pattern, and I'm going to argue Iowa's in actually worse shape than most of the states for reasons that are going to become apparent. So if you look at employment, we're back to pre-pandemic employment levels, but of course the population has continued to grow. And so what you would hope is that we're actually back to employing the same share of the population that we did pre-pandemic, and that hasn't happened. If you look at the labor force participation rates, it's only about 1%, but 1% of the employment base in the US is 1.6 million people. So we have persistently 1.6 million fewer people who want a job, and as a consequence, the share of the population that's employed is also persistently low over that period of time, and it doesn't look like we're recovering. So very early on, we had what they called the Great Resignation, right? We had labor force participation rates that fell. There was recovery about half of that, but the rest of the recovery has not occurred, and it's not likely to occur. When you look at the numbers that we had here before, you'll notice that we had 4.8 million unfilled vacancies in a month. So where are those people? Where are those people, right? So 1.6 million apparently just dropped out of the labor market. The other thing that happened in the pandemic is every year there's a certain number of people who come to the US and legally get employment through H-1B visas or other legal employment. The pandemic shut that down. And if you look at the number of legal immigration that did not occur during the pandemic, it's another 1.8 million people. So if you add the 1.8 million people who didn't immigrate to the United States to the 1.6 million domestic workers who left apparently permanently from the labor market, that seems to be why persistently we're running into this month by month problem of unfilled vacancies. We're just not going to get that back. Iowa's in even worse shape. Okay, so where did the people who left the labor force come from? They came from people over the age of 45, okay? People talked about, oh, what happened to daycare or when school shut down? It must be that all the young people were leaving the labor market because they couldn't find somebody to take care of their kids. In fact, a lot of those people were taking care of their kids because they were able to work from home. But if you look at labor force participation rates for young people in Iowa, they went up, okay? where did we lose people? Atypically, people in Iowa work, okay? Our labor force participation rates are unusually high. If you compare them to the labor force participation rates pre-pandemic for the US as a whole, in every one of these things you'll notice labor force participation rates in Iowa are higher than they are for the rest of the country. The pandemic caused a reversion to the mean for the people who are over the age of 45. And the presumption is they're not coming back into the labor market. I mean, if you look at Florida, this wasn't as big a problem. Why? Because old people in Florida, they're not there to work, right? They're there to retire, okay? And so if you stay in Iowa and you work, then you go to Florida, right? So maybe that's what's happening. But we're not going to get these people back, and these numbers are not small. So if the overall labor market, we're about 1% below pre-pandemic labor force participation rates in Iowa, we're 2% below. And so it's a lot harder to find workers in Iowa now than it was. So if we think the young people are going to enter and take those jobs, they're already in the labor market. We don't have a lot of upside potential there. We can probably get people from Illinois to come to Iowa, except they haven't in the past and they're not likely to come in the future, right? Iowa atypically is made up of workers who were born in Iowa. So the other source of workers in Iowa has been, and the buffer for Iowa has been immigration. About 40% of the population growth since 2000 in Iowa is immigration, and we're not exactly friendly to that yet. So if you think what's going to be happening to the economy of Iowa, absent a way to solve this labor market problem, it's going to be a tough future for the state. So what does it mean that we don't have as many workers as, and yell at me when I know I'm supposed to do 20 minutes and you can only take so much economics, and 21 minutes is, causes indigestion. So what does it mean? I mean, people have been complaining about supply chain problems and they think it's computer chips or something like that. The biggest supply chain problem is labor. If you think of 4.8 million unfilled vacancies, that's a lot of production that's not happening every month. And at the same time, you've got demand for goods and services that is chasing this artificially low level of production that's occurring in the United States. And so if you look at the rate of inflation, the Fed focuses on the blue, which is what they call core inflation. They take out the effect of energy prices, which are unstable, and they take out the effect of food, which is also unstable, and they look at the core of the rest of those goods and services. The Fed starts to increase interest rates in about March of 2022, okay? And they've had a series of these things. How effective have they been so far in curbing inflation? Some people take credit for, oh, look, overall the rate of inflation isn't as high as it was in July of 2022 when it went up to 8.5%. But this is basically a blip upwards following the Ukraine war. Now Russia's oil is back in the market. It's just that they're selling it to China and India, not to Western Europe. But the core inflation hasn't budged yet. And it's going to be very difficult for the Fed to fight that because they can't solve the labor market supply chain problem. And so what they're trying to do is to reduce the demand for goods and services. Why is the demand for goods and services so high? Oh, I was going to show you just to depress the hell out of you. This is consumer confidence, okay? Consumer confidence goes up when the value of the money is relatively stable. It goes down when you have inflation. Consumer confidence in the US is lower than it was during the Great Recession. And it's stayed persistently down because people are worried about inflation. And if you have inflation, it's hard to make decisions on big ticket items like a house or investments or durable goods, right? And so those sorts of things, since we haven't experienced it, we had a very stable value of the money for a very long period of time. Now you have people who are having to confront inflation for the very first time. So was government policy responsible for some of this? This is the Great Recession here, and you can look at transfer payments as a share of total income. And you'll notice that, well, we did what the government usually does in a recession. We're going to try to stabilize the economy by putting a lot of dollars in consumers' hands, and we hope that they're going to spend that, and that's going to stimulate the economy. And it did, right? Because savings rates didn't really change during the Great Recession. They sort of ticked up afterwards, and Bob and I have talked about this in the past. But it's not a big deal, right? So, I mean, here's the Great Recession. Some stuff happened. This is the pandemic recession. Transfer payments as a share of total income go up 10 percentage points like that, okay? And there are all these things, you know, we're going to put $3,600 into a child tax credit, and if your income is below a certain level, you're getting $1,400 per person in your household, and we're going to jack up the unemployment insurance benefit and all these other things that are happening over that period of time. But all of those transfer payments don't have something on the other side of the equation, and that's production of goods and services. So we're putting a huge increase. Iowa per capita incomes rose 9% in 2021. Okay, 93% of that increase is transfer payments. Okay, so you have this huge increase of dollars on the one side of the equation and no production on the other side. And if it was supposed to stimulate the economy, there was nothing to buy. We shut down the economy, right? So it all got saved. So here's what happens to the savings rate at the time those transfer payments get dumped into the economy. Well, then things reopen, and here's what's happened to the savings rate since then, okay? If you look at credit card debt in the US, it's skyrocketed in the last year. If you look at savings rates, it's well below the long run average. People are wanting to spend that money, but there's not a lot of goods and services that are available. The other problem is, if this is the Great Recession again, the federal government is 21% of GDP, long term. It blips up during recessions, but then it goes back to 21%. When we dump this much money into the economy, suddenly now the federal government is going to be a larger share of GDP, which means we have to transfer resources from one part of the economy to another part of the economy, and transferring resources, transferring inputs, transferring labor is expensive. And that's a persistent source of inflationary pressures going forward. It's particularly hard to transfer resources when you're already got 4.8 million unfilled vacancies per month, right? So if we think labor is going to be moving from some sectors to new sectors, it's going to come at a cost. And so in the past, and in 1982, there were big shifts in the share of the economy from manufacturing to goods and to services. That shifting of resources from one part of the economy to another part of the economy was responsible for some of the inflation that we had in the late 1970s and early 1980s. We now have the federal government who's leading that supply chain problem, right? Why? Because we're going to have to build a whole bunch of stuff that we weren't building before, and those resources are going to have to go from something else, right? We don't have enough inputs to go around. The Federal Reserve has the option of monetizing the debt or not. The huge increase in federal spending got monetized by the federal government. This is the Great Recession. This is what happens, and then we undo it. This is the pandemic. It's a much larger infusion of dollars into the economy over a much shorter period of time, and it took a long time for them to start undoing it. And so that is another source of inflationary pressures. Okay, so what's the other problem? We had states that varied in terms of how aggressively they shut down their economies. The idea was we wanted to flatten the curve. Vaccines were going to come online starting a little bit in December of 2020 already, but by 2021 vaccines were going to be released, and then we were going to go back to where we were before. But some states were very persistent in shutting down their economies. Other states were more aggressive in reopening their economies. It turns out that Iowa was one of the most aggressive, But we're still in this lower quadrant where we have fewer people employed and a lower labor supply than we had before. We're here not because of the government policy not reopening. We're performing relatively poorly in this group of reopening economies because we were a relatively old labor force going into the pandemic, and those people left. The states that are doing the best were also aggressive, but were relatively young, like Utah, Idaho, Texas. Florida's labor force is young, even though their population is old, but their labor force is relatively young. You'll notice that most of the states in the upper quadrant who have now more employment and a greater labor supply than they had pre-pandemic are the ones that were more aggressive in reopening their economies, and the states atypically in the lower quadrant are the ones that shut down, and they're now facing difficulty in getting their economies restarted. They, in essence, if you keep an economy or keep firms out of production for a long period of time, it's hard for them to get restarted again. Okay, I'm almost out of time, so this is, here's Des Moines. It's actually positive, so that looks good. Here's Iowa as a whole, so Des Moines is doing better than Iowa, but you look at where the big increases are in Des Moines. There's certainly transportation and utilities. This is one of the results of the pandemic, is the increase in online sales, and Des Moines was well positioned to increase their warehousing and trucking business. And so Des Moines has benefited from that. But they also benefited from the huge infusion of monies to state governments that increased employment in Des Moines. Iowa State, not doing so hot with the pandemic. We've lost a few students. Our private sector is doing great, but overall Ames employment is still below where it was pre-pandemic. And this is state government jobs that exited, same thing in Waterloo and Cedar Falls. I don't know what Iowa City is doing, but we're going to have to talk to somebody in the state government to say we want some of that money. But Des Moines is one of the few bright spots in Iowa in terms of getting back to where they were pre-pandemic. Overall, Iowa's still not there, even though the U.S. as a whole is now about 1 percentage points above where they were pre-pandemic. And I think that's sort of what I had in mind. The issues, I think, that are facing the U.S. government are, how are you going to make up for this persistent lack of labor supply, given that it's people who left are the people who retired, and for all intents and purposes, they're not coming back. And the answer has to be to try to get, the only sources of new employment are going to be to do something about immigration policy to try to make up for the people that did not come legally here in that 2-year period. And neither party is interested in doing that. So I think you're going to still see persistent underemployment in the U.S. economy going forward, and that underemployment in the U.S. economy is one of the fundamental drivers of inflation going forward. So I think it's going to be a bumpy ride. That's what I got. Sorry, yes. Questions? Yes.
Well, if you think inflation is going to be persistent, how high do you think the Fed funds rate is going to get? And when do you think the Fed will stop increasing rates?
If you remember Chairman Powell's comments, he was trying to emphasize that the rate of inflation had started to trickle down. I think he said it repeatedly over that period of time. I don't think that he thinks that they've made that much progress yet. I think what he was trying to do is to talk down inflationary expectations. Because if you look, the University of Michigan also asked people what they think inflation is going to be. It's over 5%. And that gets then incorporated in future wage increases. Because if you think the cost of living is rising by 5%, you want a raise of at least 5% each year. And that's that wage price spiral that we had in the early 1970s when the unemployment rate was high Now the wage price spiral is going to be, with the unemployment rate low, artificially low because it's people who exited the labor market, which is why the unemployment rate is so low, but also very low employment rates. If you look at the current interest rates, they're still below the rate of inflation, which means real interest rates are negative, which is typically expansionary monetary policy. I don't think that they're going to stop raising interest rates anytime soon unless they start seeing some serious reductions in that core inflation component of inflation. So I think they're gonna keep raising interest rates in the near term.
So what's your guess as to what level?
Well, Volcker raised him. My mortgage was 12.5%. I don't think it's going to go up that high. If we go into a recession, you're going to see some abatement of consumer demand, and ultimately, I think they're actually hoping for a mild recession. When you see 4.8 million unfilled vacancies, conditions are pretty good for a mild recession, right? You could, what's the difference? You could have 2.8 million unfilled vacancies, it'd still be the same number of people employed. So I think they're hoping to slow down the rate of new job openings and presume that there's enough labor supply to meet the smaller number of job vacancies that are existing in the U.S. Yeah?
This morning there was a hearing on expanding the employment of teenagers. Is that likely? Well, it's probably going to pass, but is it likely to make much of a difference?
So the question is should we, is having more 14-year-olds in manufacturing plants a good, going to make much of a difference? This is really a strange state, isn't it? Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to eliminate taxation on retirement incomes in order to make sure that we got more opportunities for 14-year-olds to help pay for the state. I don't think it's going to make a whole lot of difference, frankly. I don't know why we would really want to make it easier for 14 and 15-year-olds. I mean, we used to be, I can remember Tom Harkin wanting fewer 14-year-olds to work on making soccer balls in Pakistan, but apparently that's, immoral. But if they're here in Iowa, that's no big deal. I don't think it's going to make any difference. If you look at labor force participation rates for high school students, they're about half what they were a generation ago. So fewer and fewer high school students are working while they're in high school, and they had that opportunity, at 16, 17, 18. So I don't think making more opportunities for even younger kids is going to make a difference at all. Yeah.
We have a pretty severe debt problem in this country and arguably around the world. And as much as the Fed would like to be restrictive, I think that the Fed wants inflation to run hotter than 2%. But the one thing that they have not addressed is a key part of that is economic growth. And we have a very restrictive regulatory policy now. If we have inflation that runs at 4%, when we have economic growth that runs at 5 or 6, that we can inflate our way arguably out of a debt problem. But we're not going to do it with 4% inflation rate and a 1 or 2% growth.
Right. The growth rate for 2022 is 1%. We actually shrank in the first 2 quarters by just a fraction, and then there was a slight rebound. I don't think that we're going to persist on that 2% level. But before 2000, the U.S. economy was pretty much growing at 3% a year, and about half of that was productivity, and about half of that was population, right? More workers. And since 2000, we've been growing at around 2%. But if your government spending is still aiming at 3% growth, and you're only growing at 2%, then you're going to create this imbalance between the size of the government and the size of the overall economy. I don't see us getting anywhere near 3% growth again, which is why you see the federal government now, the projections, those are from the Congressional Budget Office, right? We're going to have steady increases of the government as a share of GDP going forward for a long time if you look at their projections. And the reason is they don't expect the overall economy to grow fast enough to moderate the effect of the federal government's spending levels. So, there was one more over somewhere. Yeah, go.
I was just going to ask, obviously with the gap between the vacancies, do you foresee this causing a shift of power in the sense that people will work where they want versus where they need to? What do you see that doing to, like, you know, the wealth distribution across America?
The question is, will the persistent lack of labor supply increase the power of workers? And the answer is absolutely, it'll increase the power of workers. What's interesting so far is even though we have, at least in terms of recent history, fairly rapid nominal wage growth, it hasn't kept up with inflation, and that can't stay forever. But I think you can view the quit rate as effectively people exercising their power, right? So they can, if they don't like what's happening here, they can move somewhere else, and that's clearly been part of the story of the pandemic economy. Sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, and then Bob can rebuttal.
I saw that Bob had a question, and there were a couple of others, Peter, so I don't know if you have time.
Yeah.
And would be willing to stick around. If you weren't able to get your question in, come up and see Bob, or Peter rather, once we're done here.
See Bob first.
But you can see both of them. Thank you, Peter, for spending time with our club today. We thank you for sharing that information, as depressing as it was. As a token of our appreciation, we're going to give a book to the Greater Des Moines Public Library in your honor. It will become part of the collection that is the Rotary Rosie Reader Van, a van that was made possible by a gift from our foundation a few years ago. So thanks again for your time. As you consider the following upcoming meetings, as always, please think about who you might want to invite to be exposed to Rotary and what we do. Always looking to add interesting new people to our club. And don't forget, next Friday we are going to be at the Botanical Garden with the sponsorship of someone who's anonymous, and we're very grateful for that, as well as Next Level Ventures for Becky's February fling. Hopefully you can make it. So that means we are not meeting here next Thursday. We'll be at the Botanical Garden on Friday. On the 23rd, we'll be hearing from Jake Christensen about what's changing in downtown development. So that'll be very interesting. And on March 2nd, this will be a new format for introducing our new members. So on March 2nd, we're going to dedicate the entire meeting to getting everyone introduced to as many as 10, hopefully, of our new members. So we're going to do something, hopefully make this be a key way for us to make sure we let everybody know who is joining our club, why they're joining the club, and what they have to offer us going forward. So please be here for that. And that's it for today. Thank you for joining us. We are adjourned.